Hey all, Dr. Levan here today, moving into part 4 of our text as we get into the subject of selection and in particular the metrics that we want to use with applicants. But before we do that, just a bit of review. Let's look at our pictorial syllabus here. You'll recall back in Chapter 1, we started off with learning the importance of being strategic with our staffing decisions. And of course, to do that, we need to truly understand what the goals and objectives of the organization are, and then making sure that we align to those. Then we talked about the HR and staffing strategy. We talked about the 13 decisions. Do we want to use a third-party vendor when we do our staffing? Do we want to hire internally or externally? Obviously, things like cost and budget come into some of those strategic decisions that we make. We then moved on to legal compliance, talked about planning, the importance of really nailing the exact number of people that we need in our organization with the goal of getting to the right person, getting the right number of people at the right time with the right competencies in our organization. We talked about a job analysis as a way to define those competencies. We then turned our attention to recruitment, making again that decision whether we're going to recruit externally or internally and some of the messaging that goes around that. And now we're getting into the selection process. So we've put the notices out there, we've gathered resumes, we've gathered application, and now we have people who have actually applied for the job, and our job now is to select the best person for that. And again, we're going to be talking about applicant metrics today, and you can see we have two objectives for this session and this chapter. The first question that I want to ask, aligning with that first objective, is really what is meant by applicant measurement and what is its importance in staffing decisions. Well, just some of the key concepts here, we're talking about measurements, and in particular, we're really talking about how we quantify some subjective things like perhaps personality or experience or professionalism or attitude. How do you truly define what a strong person is? And I'm just going to make a quick editorial comment about that. So often people just get into situations and they get into interviews and they go with some sort of gut feeling, and that really doesn't work very well. I want to look at some of the specific types of measurements that we're going to be using as we talk about this topic. First of all, we have a nominal metric, and that is that the data can only be classified. So do you have a certain certification, for example? Do you have a CPA degree? Or if you're in human resources, a PHR certification? How about languages spoken? Again, these things can only be classified. We then have ordinal data, data that can actually be ranked but doesn't have a number per se. So for example, your education level, you might say I have a high school education, I have a college education, I have a master's degree or a doctorate degree. So again, there is some sort of ranking to that, but it's not a numeric type of ranking. You also have interval types of metrics. So this is where there is a meaningful difference when you compare two numbers. So you might have IQ. So you might be comparing somebody with 140 IQ to somebody with 100 IQ. Or personality traits. You might have somebody who's they may be 40% of an extrovert, where somebody else might only be in the 20% category. So you can make some comparisons there. And also very close to an interval type of metric is something called a ratio metric. And that's when you have a true zero. So total sales. You have zero, all the way up to maybe you've sold $1 million or something like that. Words per minute that you can type. Your GPA, the years of experience. So these types of metrics, again, really will help you in determining who your best applicant is. And why do we care about this? Why do we even want to bother with this? And that is to minimize subjectivity. As I alluded to earlier, people tend to often want to make these snap judgments about things. Maybe they'll focus too much on one attribute, and they'll really end up making bad decisions. Many folks, I'm usually nervous about the folks who say, you know, I've just got a sense for these things. I've got a good feeling about these. I can just kind of make these hiring decisions on the fly. Statistically, those things don't work out too well. As a matter of fact, SHRM has done a study that said 63% of all hiring decisions, not first impressions, mind you, but hiring decisions are made during the first 4.3 minutes of an interview. And you think typically what has happened in the first 4.3 minutes of an interview, and that is somebody has said hi. And they tend to play into all of our biases, either positively or negatively. So for example, maybe I went to a school and you went to that same school. Well, if I start making that connection, all of a sudden I like you, really just because you went to a school, not necessarily because you have qualifications. So this topic of applicant metrics is so important. And I encourage people to not only get these metrics, but then when they're doing interviews, score people individually and then compare the numbers at the end. And you're often surprised how one person will say, oh, I think they really did well in this area, and another person will say, no, not so much. And if you have people score those numbers early on before they talk to each other, you'll get much more accurate and candid conversations. Now, when selecting these metrics, you can see here's a process. Let's just pretend, for example, that we're going to hire an airplane mechanic. First thing you would want to do is choose and define an attribute. In this case, you would want somebody to have a pretty good knowledge of mechanical principles. Secondly, you're going to develop a measure of that attribute. So you might come up with a paper and pencil kind of test. Obviously, you could do that on a survey monkey or computer, but really you're going to give somebody a quiz as to mechanical principles. You then measure the attribute by having the applicant actually take the quiz. You determine the number of the score on that quiz. Then you make an evaluation, whether that's good or bad. And then you compare that to other individuals, maybe with some other personality traits or other metrics that you're using, and then make that hiring decision. So again, you can see applicant metrics are very, very important in the selection process.